It seems that Jarrah White, the grandson of the Apollo moon hoax conspiracy theory, although I'm not sure that conspiracy theories can actually have offspring, has taken his 500-kilogram hammer and delivered another blow to the Apollo program. This time, he claims that moon rocks, which are 216 times heavier than their counterparts on the Earth, can be scattered for the same pressure.
This was in response to an earlier video in which I pointed out that the rocks that could be lifted on the moon by the LEM's exhaust were 216 times heavier than what could be lifted under the same conditions in Earth-strength gravity. It's well known that gravity on the moon is 6 times less than on Earth, so you might expect the rocks that could be lifted by the LEM should be 6 times heavier in terms of mass. What's particularly interesting here, though, is that while the diameter of these rocks we can lift on the moon is greater by a factor of 6, their mass increases by the cube of that. So contrary to what one might expect, the rocks you can scatter on the moon are not 6 times heavier, but 216 times heavier. That's because as the rock gets heavier and larger, their surface area increases. Like a giant sail facing the wind then, there's more exposed area for the rocket exhaust to push against. So, if Fair Webb or anyone else wants to claim the exhaust pressure was only 0.3 psi, go right ahead. With so little gravity holding them down, that sort of pressure would dig through and scatter a loose pile of bricks. Now, like most propagandists, Coyote obviously dislikes this factor of 216 as it deals a massive blow to the argument that the LEM exhaust couldn't dig a crater in the lunar surface. And a big crater at that. So, Coyote tries to turn this around, saying that I calculated the moon's gravity to be 216 times lower than the Earth's. He then tried to show that my ratio should only be a factor of 6.
I then took Jarrah's columns of air, showing that the Earth column with a puny radius of 1.05 meters supported a rock on the moon that has a mass 6 times greater than the Earth rock, at 6 times the density. And the huge moon column with its mighty radius of 6.30 meters supported a rock on the Earth with a mass 6 times less than the rock on the moon, but 1/6 density.
To do this, he makes the density of the rocks what he calls a degree of freedom, basically saying the rock's density can be variable.
Now you are probably saying that is unfair because Jarrah kept the density of the rock on the moon the same. It's a moot point, because if we go back to the fundamentals of how Jarrah set up his equilibrium condition, he fixes the value of pressure, but because he allowed the radius of the sphere to change, he also allowed the volume to change and the mass to change, and therefore he introduced what is known as a degree of freedom into the problem, and that degree of freedom manifested itself in the fact that the ratio of the two areas for a fixed value of P is 36, and Jarrah's other observation, that as you increase the surface area, you also increase the mass along with it. It's not rocket science. Oh, hang on, it is, isn't it? I am only solving that equilibrium condition according to the degrees of freedom Jarrah introduced.
Oh, sure. When you're on the moon, you can compress rocks to any density you want, right? Now, to get his factor to be 6 instead of 216, he needed to increase the density of quartz 6 times. Doing that would allow the rock to be 6 times heavier while keeping its same size and surface area. Except, for some reason, instead of 6, he increased the density 36 times. I mean, seriously folks, his videos need to be seen to be believed. The densities he shows are not even comparable to the true density of a quartz silicate, which is 2650 kilograms per cubic meter. Speaking of which, why doesn't he display the right units? It's per meter cubed, not per meter. That should be a -3. He's repeated this mistake right throughout the video. This is coming from someone who hypes over a misspelling in a personal email, would you believe? As for how he arrived at 36 instead of 6, I can only guess he got it from dividing 216 by 6. But even if he meant to increase the density by 6 instead of 36, his argument would still be wrong, because you can't change the density. And neither of the densities he shows are comparable to quartz. The density given for his earth rocks are 6 times lighter than that. If he gave them the proper density, his moon rocks would end up 8 times denser than lead. When I posted the original version of this video, AstroBrand2 wrote this in response. Apparently, you still do not understand that the mass of an object resists a force applied to it regardless of the gravity. Even if your pile of bricks was in outer space, the exhaust would not blow them all over the place as you illustrate. A tiny amount of gravity would overwhelm the small movement. This is complete nonsense. If my pile of bricks was in outer space, the exhaust would blow them so far away that they would disappear as dim stars. In fact, in space, you'd be able to push something about half the mass of the lunar module with very little force at all. Don't take my word for it, Dr. Werner von Braun agreed. On page 57 of his book, Conquest of the Moon, this is what he wrote when discussing ways of jettisoning his theoretical moonship's spent fuel tanks used for translunar injection burn. The shedding of the tanks can be done in various ways. The most primitive method would be to unscrew the outer supporting struts and simply give the tanks a gentle shove. Surprising as it may sound, this would be sufficient to give 2 bulky 7-ton units enough speed to make them drift slowly away from each ship. While the tanks will follow our unpowered cruising ellipse for a time, they will gradually drift away, and after a few days will disappear as dim stars. If we can put a 7-ton fuel tank in motion just by gently shoving it, sending a pile of bricks off into space with very little force should be child's play. The rest of his videos are the usual garbage, like claiming I can't do basic math, or this one, claiming my corrections are proving 1 equals 1. Remember, this is coming from someone who thinks the density of the moon rocks is adjustable. Here, he alleges my explanation for how I arrived at this error in Sony Vegas is purely smoke and mirrors, a playing the victim act. What Coyote does not reveal in his video is that Apollo Lunar Surface Journal contributor made the same mistake as I, confusing how Sony Vegas recognizes the video's velocity and speeding it up to 150%. For the record, this video was released on January 10, 2008, 17 days before I released mine. Yet, while all the propagandists criticized me and clung to this one oversight as definitive proof that I can't do basic math, and to this day continue to harass me over it, no one, and I mean no one, even said boo to over arriving at the same error. Instead, they all gave him the usual congratulations and backpatting remarks that they give any other pro-NASA video. Point this out all you want to S-Vector, Shane Killian, and the rest of the trolls. They'll avoid error like the plague. Though, when I questioned Coyote about this, he acknowledged that had made an error. But he repeatedly refused to answer a simple yes or no question. Is incapable of basic math? It's a fair question. They allege that I can't do basic math over the 150% velocity oversight. I'm sure we'd all love to know why the propagandists play favourites and don't question mathematical skills over the exact same error. I could go through explaining the corrections here again, but it would be lost on him. If you want to see the corrections, it's this video here. I'll put a link in the sidebar.